Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me as ever, we have Spiked's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spiked columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, Tory sleaze, COVID scaremongering, Harry and Meghan, and the historian cancelled for impersonating Hitler. So the Westminster sleaze scandal is rumbling on. We've had Owen Paterson falling on his sword after being accused of an egregious breach of the parliamentary lobbying rules. There's been accusations that the Conservatives are giving out peerages to their big donors, the alleged so-called 3 million club. And most recently, there's been talk about Geoffrey Cox, the highest paid MP in Britain, who's been criticised for some of his work with the British Virgin Islands as a barrister. I mean, Tom, what have you made of all of this so far?
Well, it's not the most important point to make, but I am struck by just the incompetence of the government in basically creating this scandal from thin air. I mean, obviously, this investigation into Owen Paterson had been rumbling on for some time, but in terms of the way it all panned out, trying to protect him and overhaul the standards process in such an incredibly cack-handed way that it basically just created this whole scandal for them. It seemed to be cooked up by Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House, and the Chief Whip, Mark Spencer. And they didn't seem to even think that this would be a problem for a lot of Tory MPs, even though a lot of them didn't end up voting for this amendment, which would have basically given Paterson a stay of execution and then allowed for this new committee to be set up to overhaul the standards. They didn't really think that, of course, Labour and the Lib Dems wouldn't actually be on board with this new committee, making it a complete kangaroo court and absolutely ridiculous. And so you have the government just blundering into a new scandal. And the thing about these things when you're talking about questions of, it's talked broadly about corruption, but everything gets chucked in the bucket, second jobs, actual instances of rule breaking, as Owen Paterson was seen to fall foul of, and Geoffrey Cox is in part accused of, at least in one aspect, but also just people making money outside of Parliament. All of it gets, journalists have basically just been going down the list of MPs' registered interests and reporting it. That's all you have to do in order to feed the beast in this situation. So it's definitely not the most important point. We'll get onto the more important points, I'm sure, but just the ability of this government to just blunder from one scandal to another, like the kind of shopping trolley, as Boris Johnson is famously known to describe himself as, it never ceases to amaze me, definitely. I mean, it feels like every week we're talking about some big, all-encompassing Tory scandal. This one just seems to have a bit more legs than the previous 3 or 4 that we've been talking about.
Yeah, Ella, I mean, it's just the government is in turmoil, isn't it, really? I mean, it feels as if there is a new scandal every week, even, bigger things than this. But we go from one crisis to the next, energy crisis to sleaze crisis to whatever it might be next week.
Yeah, well, I'm not always a big fan of Marina Hyde's articles in The Guardian, but one thing she did point out, which was quite funny, is that Boris Johnson was interviewed somewhere in a hospital, and to get off the questions of sleaze, he push the questions onto coronavirus. And given how screwed up the government has been around coronavirus, she was saying it tells you something that they're trying to divert towards a thing that they haven't wanted to talk about for a long time, just to get away from the sleaze crisis. It's a bit like the expenses scandal, or when tax dodging or all those things come up. You're tempted to say, well, kind of, who knew it? MPs are involved in like backhanded stuff and a bit of cash here, or even, more obvious kind of in your face elements of corruption, or just sort of stupidity, like going to the Virgin Islands and making loads of money and voting from there, or doing things that most of us would seem unsavoury and not what an MP should be getting up to. You're tempted to say, oh, well, whatever, who knew it? But I think the important point here is that the Tory government has, since 2019, attempted to at least make a name for itself as this kind of populisty, but also like grassroots level up kind of party who, the new party of the poor, the party who really cares about the average Joe. And I think it's probably not a superficial point to even though it does feel a bit like a lame lefty point, to say, well, it's quite clear that people who are crowing about the difficulty of living on an MP's salary, or the fact that they just had to do this second job and have these second interests and second income to survive living in London, you think, oh, please, there's an element of not just out of touchness here, but a sign that a lot of this craw thumping around levelling up isn't really based in reality if you have individuals who carry on like this. However, I mean, the Labour Party does it as well. So it's not that it's just a Conservative thing. And obviously Keir Starmer got caught out.
I think he paid like 25 grand this Parliament or something like that for his outside legal work, was in talks with Miss Condorea to have some sort of advisory role. It's no mistake that Angela Rayner has been leading the charge in Parliament and elsewhere about all of these kinds of things. But that's the nature of these sorts of scandals, is that they end up reflecting badly on all sides of the House, they end up breeding a certain cynicism. The problem is that you do have instances of questionable behaviour and explicit rule breaking, but the problem is that gets kind of folded into a kind of broader shill cry about corruption, which can often be a bit discombobulating in terms of working out what has and hasn't been done, what isn't allowed, but can also just feed cynicism in the absence of actually trying to do anything about it. And I think the other thing that's always worth saying is that these kind of corruption scandals, the upshot of them always is to empower some kind of new committee, some kind of new external process. We need to bring High Court judges in, or we need to bring various different experts in. And I think the answer to all of these, especially in situations where things are a bit borderline, where things are a question of should they be doing that rather than are they allowed to be doing that, then it's about the accountability to voters, making them accountable effectively to, again, either the lay members or the sitting MPs of the Standards Committee, or to votes in the House, is obviously ridiculous when MPs are there because their constituents put them there. And what's very clear is that the kind of apparatus for keeping MPs on the straight and narrow has completely failed. I mean, the standards procedure as it is now was effectively constructed, in the wake of the former kind of Tory cash for questions scandal. Again, there were kind of reforms that were made in the wake of the expenses scandal as well, none of which has helped. And I think the reason for that is they always miss the kind of democratic component to it. So in 2010, all of the major parties went in with some sort of pledge around recall, so allowing constituents to be able to force a by-election if they get the requisite amount of petitioners and all the rest of it. But the fudge they ended up with, because again, there was this terror about actually subjecting MPs, some of them which might be sitting ministers or the Prime Minister even to this kind of process, means what you ended up with was a situation where, yes, there could be a recall petition, but it would only be if they were convicted of fiddling their expenses or given a custodial sentence, or if the Standards Committee had recommended, I think, more than 10 days suspension, and then that goes through off of a vote in Parliament. So it's still very much controlled. Whereas I think, especially given how messy a lot of this stuff is, the question should be that the public should be empowered to hold their MPs to account more than they are now. Let them weed through the rights and wrongs of all of this stuff, rather than just making it kind of, again, just unending trial by media and then some kind of, souped up standards procedure at the end of it. That, I think, I wonder why we're having so little of that discussion at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even, some of the borderline cases where you're thinking, is it illegal? Is it against the rules? But it just feels a bit wrong. Those things, MPs probably just wouldn't even go there if they felt the voters breathing down their neck, if they knew that they were truly being accountable for, what they get up to in their time, in their time that we pay for as well. One other aspect to come out of this we should talk about is the Lords. And, Mick Hume wrote a very good piece on Spiked, which made the point that actually, the appointments to the Lords that are within the rules, that aren't, blatantly corrupt, as in someone has literally paid for their peerage, are just as bad. It's just as corrupting to the democratic influence and democratic process.
Yeah, it's the same way that people sort of get more upset about hereditary peers or things like that, rather than peers who were elected by the Conservative or Labour Party because they have done some kind of service to society or whatever excuse they use.
Or service to the Tory Party. Or Labour Party.
Every member of the House of Lords is there illegitimately if you believe in democracy, as we do. And, at Spiked, we believe in abolishing the Lords because of that very fact that it acts as an undemocratic check on the process of what happens in the Commons, which is the process of politics that supposedly we are meant to decide on. But a point that a few people have been making throughout the week, which I think links in with this question of democracy, and actually, as you mentioned, Fraser, the idea that MPs and certainly Lords don't feel the pressure of voters, don't feel that kind of democratic need breathing down their neck, is that the biggest example of corruption in the last 6 years has been the attempt to overthrow Brexit. And I know that some people watching this podcast will think, oh my God, they're talking about Brexit again. But the reason why that's important is because, when it comes to cut through with voters, I think one mistake that the Labour Party is making at the moment now, and indeed the Lib Dems, is they're kind of like, oh, we've got them, we've got them in their dirty money. in actual fact, the thing that it's not that people don't care about MPs acting badly, or, we shouldn't be cynical about that and we should change the rules and make it all proper and whatever. But it's that, the thing that really matters to us is not when MPs get a bit of cash for doing a speech somewhere at some bank, but whether or not they enact the things that we vote for. And from, left to right, all across the political spectrum, there was an attempt to undermine democracy. So you end up, when it comes to talking about corruption, political corruption, I think that's far more important and is also ongoing, because we have rejoin attempts and all sorts of discussions about that, how terrible Brexit is even a million years after it happened now.
I mean, just on the Brexit thing as well, because I think whether you're talking about the House of Lords, any institution that is further away, further divorced from the people, it's going to become more and more corrupt. They've just got more places to hide. They wield power without accountability. All of that is so clear. And even if you're talking about MPs themselves, I mean, it's interesting, at least from the Tory party, from what I can tell, a lot of this kind of extra jobs stuff seems to be the preserve of safe seat MPs, because they don't fear their own electorate. They've also got a lot more time. They're not having to go to every single constituency meeting, having to kiss babies and weigh lambs or whatever it is you do in these various different places in order to maintain a kind of presence and a sense that you're there and representing people. So again, anything which just creates more distance or insulates people from the public, the more in which you have corruption flourish. It's not about these external pressures. And again, it's funny hearing so many of the kind of Remainers, screaming about Tory corruption and us becoming some banana republic. They should go to Brussels and see how the sausage is made, because there when you have just this politics done behind closed doors, there's a lot of corruption which goes on there as well. So yes, just bring politics closer back to the people, make them keep MPs honest, rather than all of these other kinds of suggestions that we're in recent days.
Ella.
There's just this really small thing, which is that there's all the discussion, but one of the things that's most disheartening is the response from some in the media commentary upset, who are like, the solution to this is that we just pay MPs more, or we pay, even pay the Prime Minister more. And when you're talking about democracy and what MPs are supposed to be doing, politicians, it shows how deep set among the metropolitan elite, or whatever you want to call them, is this idea that politics has to be, as you say, Tom, removed from people. They have to be experts that are paid to do extortionate amounts to do politics, to remove themselves away from normal life to an even greater extent, rather than, there is something to be said, not about having a job given us, giving advice to some consultancy firm, but for politicians living in the real world. One of the biggest problems we have is that so many of the politicians, to not, without sounding cynical, are career politicians. They go from, student position to some kind of consultancy, bang into a constituency, and they have no touch with the real world, and therefore then paying them £300,000, some are suggesting, to remain out of touch with the real world doesn't seem like a solution, and tells you something about the way we value democracy.
I do wonder though, because on the pay stuff, I think people would be a lot less, a lot more inclined to kind of talk about that as an issue, because the reason that MPs never want to put it up is because they know it looks terrible.
Yeah.
The reason it looks terrible is because people don't trust them.
Yeah.
The reason it's such a kind of horrendous situation, and why they just really don't want to go anywhere near it or even open this discussion, let alone anything else, is because of that. Because again, the more that politics has drifted away from people over recent decades, the more people are just going to assume that they got their nose in the trough, and they're not doing what they should be doing, that they are, in the pocket of X, Y, Z. So again, I feel like all of these discussions, it would just be completely different if there wasn't that kind of baked in, I don't want to say cynicism, but certainly a level of skepticism, which is bred of how distant the two parts are.
You're watching the Spiked podcast. If you're enjoying the show so far and like what we have to say, then why don't you consider becoming a Spiked supporter? Spiked Supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. If you give £5 or more per month, or £50 or more per year, you can become a Spiked supporter and get a whole load of extra perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all the items in our shop, and you can bookmark articles as you browse the Spiked website. This is our way of saying thank you to those of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and it always will be. So we're incredibly grateful to those of you who hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can access Spiked. If you don't give to Spiked yet, then now is the perfect time. Just head to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. Thank you. And now back to the Spiked podcast. The head of NHS England made a remarkable statement this week. She said that hospital beds have 14 times as many COVID patients as they did last year. Now, this was totally false. It would have been completely impossible for this to have been the case. Probably would have meant around 150,000 COVID patients in hospital, more than there's ever been at any one time.
There's currently like 7,000, something like that.
Yes, yeah. It's really,
quite off.
it's off by a country mile. But obviously, the claim was repeated in the media, and the media have been doing some of their own kind of spinning of statistics. Every time you turn on Sky News, it feels like they're telling you that cases are spiking or rising or at record levels. I mean, it's just there is now a point where the mainstream media has sort of become fake news on COVID in a way that is, really quite shocking. I mean, what have we made of this?
Well, I think it's just the inability to report the good news on COVID in recent weeks has just become so ridiculous. As you say, you've had a few instances of just pushing complete nonsense statistics. I don't know where Amanda Pritchard got those figures from. I think she's claiming it was comparing August to August or something like that, but we're in November, so I don't know how that... And also, when people actually bothered to take 30 seconds to fact check it, they went to look at government NHS numbers. It's not like these weren't at our fingertips. It's all very, very strange. But what's also interesting is, again, the inability of the media to just be like, hang on, that's definitely not true. I think on the one hand, it's because a lot of political journalists are just uninterested in COVID anymore. Partly, they just think of it as a kind of stick with which to beat the government. They don't really, it's not something they're necessarily tracking in the same way anymore. But I think there was the FT who have been keeping track of all of this, of course, and have been somewhat prophets of doom in some respects in terms of how they presented data, and pointed out that today, we're recording this on the Thursday, it's been in England something like 18 consecutive days of week-on-week declines in cases. Like, you just would have no idea if you turned on the media. And in the past week, and loads of people have been pointing this out, it's everyone. It's Sky News, it's the BBC, CNN, all of them said something along the lines of, well, of course, cases are going up. It's just received wisdom.
Yeah.
But it's just completely detached from reality. I can't work out what the reason is for this, other than the fact that they've just stopped paying attention to the extent that they were ever paying that much close attention to begin with. But it just seems like, where COVID is concerned, they're addicted to bad news and they don't know what to do with good news. I just can't make head nor tail of it, really.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there's almost a sense of disappointment among some in the media that A, things are going better than expected, but also that we're not moving to this plan B, with vaccine passports and masks? There's always been a policy preference among journalists for more stringent measures.
Yeah, well, you don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist who kind of believes in the idea that the media has this sort of cynical ploy. But there is something in the fact that, as Tom says, at these press conferences, and indeed in the kind of drive to report negatively or, do kind of scaremongering reporting around coronavirus, there is ample opportunity for gotchas. And we're living in an increased age of gotcha journalism, which is, you said that you would do this by this date and you didn't, haha, or you said that hospital rates would be this and they're this percentage. And it's cheap. And also it doesn't resonate with viewers, because I think most of us stopped watching the press conferences at least a long time ago, because they're depressing, and also because in a positive way, people can instinctively feel that things are starting to change for the better. Places are opening up, people are feeling more confident, dare I say it, people are even excited for Christmas, whereas if you look back to last year, it was like horrendous. And so people are enjoying that kind of normality resuming. And I think that there's a fear among some journalists, and particularly reporters who are, the kind of Westminster set, who like to be able to give a little bit of juicy gossip on what someone's done wrong, which has its place in news journalism, but is feeding off this idea that the media has had a very privileged position in the last 19 months of the pandemic, in that because we have been kept out of politics and kept out of life, they have been our only means to have access to politicians, and they've enjoyed a privileged position of power that perhaps they didn't have previously. And I think that's going to be very hard to let go of. I mean, it's also the case that they pick and choose what they want to report on. We've had some very serious things happen in the last week. Vaccine passports brought in for care home residents, which I had a different view on back when the vaccine was seen as this kind of ultimate panacea, and when the cases were really high. But now you might change your mind slightly after looking at transmissibility and its effectiveness around that, or also the fact that all the unions are coming out and saying this is a terrible idea. I mean, in Wales, they're bringing COVID passports, not just for frontline important staff, but, in all types of cases. And no one really cares apart from us and some of our sport, and you just think, but this is huge. Why aren't you going crazy about this? And it's because the balance has always been, and it continues to be, frightening coronavirus up here, civil liberties down there, and it has never managed to balance out in any way, shape, or form, and that's still a problem.
Tom,
I think it's just interesting that there seems to be a kind of atmosphere which has been created around all of this stuff, which, as I say, is just kind of, you can't ever report the good stuff about this. And I'm just trying to get to grips with like what that really is about. And I think your point's about, they gain so much more moral authority through this. But at the same time, journalists had a really bad pandemic. There's no two ways about it. I mean, just look at Robert Peston's antics over the course of this, trying to lecture Jonathan Van Tam about the difference between antigen and antibody tests and completely ballsing it up, looking at, again, some of the statistics around, I think, cases amongst the vaccinated, getting it completely wrong, writing blogs about this stuff. So there's not much humility on the basis of all of this, which I really find quite strange, given the fact that, there's huge problems with the way in which the media has covered COVID. They definitely have crossed the line time and again from just reporting the situation and basically advocating certain kinds of policies and the most stringent lockdown policies imaginable. All of this stuff in terms of cases and their seeming inability to even recognise that things are actually going in a good direction is no doubt because of the fact that they've basically been campaigning for these Plan B measures, reintroduction of mandatory masks, vaccine passports, working from home again, all these kinds of things since that Plan B was drawn up. And again, so that part of it has been really horrendous because they have just crossed the line again from, holding the government to account to advocating a particular kind of policy. But there's also the sort of thing where just in terms of the nuts and bolts of this, these people who kind of pose as these little geniuses who are across absolutely everything and are really there to tell you what's what, they've just had no idea what they're talking about, and they're certainly, their view of the statistics and the situation that we're in is incredibly warped by their own biases. That much is obvious. I think a lot of this is unthinking, and a product of ineptitude, rather than it is some sort of sinister conspiracy. But it's definitely a damning indictment of them. There's no two ways about that.
Well, let's stick with the media for a little bit. The things on our front page at the moment. Harry and Meghan are back all over the newspapers, particularly Meghan. She's apologised for potentially misleading the court. Harry has come out and claimed that the word Megxit is sexist. Tom, are any of those stories take your fancy?
Well, I don't
you've been enjoying. You've been reading Finding Freedom.
I mean, the case between the Markles and the Mail on Sundays publishers is going through the Court of Appeal at the moment. So there's things that are drifting out of that, but we'll know a bit more. Probably, people watching this podcast will know more about this by the time we get to it. So we should probably park that. But the Megxit thing I thought was quite fun. I mean, so he was on this Wired panel about online disinformation, or something like this, and he goes into
World
this
expert.
Well, he's actually got one of his many jobs, is that he's on this commission of the Aspen Institute looking into online misinformation and disinformation. What qualifies him for that? I have no idea. But so along other pearls of wisdom, apparently he said that he warned Jack Dorsey at Twitter that the storming of the Capitol was going to happen before. So I tried to warn you that something like this would happen, which is both sinister and funny at the same time in terms of his new outsized role in the elites. But the Megxit comment is fascinating. So his point was that it is and was a misogynistic slur. I think the reason for this is because, as a lot of people pointed out at the time of Megxit, was that this hashtag had been circulating in the kind of murkier corners of the internet amongst people who just really didn't like Meghan, some of them for bigoted reasons, no doubt. So there's a little bit of truth to what he's saying. But we all know what he's trying to do with this, which is to conflate criticism of him and his wife with misogyny in this case, because I guess he's, gone hoarse talking about racism for 5 minutes. That seems to be exactly what it is. Megxit, it's Meghan and exit, like Brexit put together. We all understand that. It's just that even if they didn't actually come up with it, when we all saw it, it was like, oh, that's just a cheeky kind of tabloid coinage. But I think this is a slightly more silly example of just how, and Harry and Meghan are par excellence for this, identity politics is just a perfect way to deflect criticism and demonize your opponents, even if you're the most privileged people imaginable. They've done that time and time again. I mean, the thing about Harry and Meghan always strikes me is they were going to war with the press before the press were going to war with them. Really.
Yeah.
Remember that? It was either a letter or a statement that he put out. This way back in 2016. This is while everyone was just quite happy for them and thought they were quite cute and whatever. Admonishing journalists for the colonial undertones of their reporting and all this kinds of stuff. And he's just really incredibly preoccupied with it. But what I find striking time and again, although I think the shine is starting to come off them a little bit, is that people just defer to these often quite ridiculous claims. They just think, fair enough, yes, of course there was something nasty about all of the coverage of you two, even in the absence of any explicit bigotry in the actual coverage. So, yeah, it's just the silliest example yet of that shtick that he and Meghan have, I think.
Ella?
Well, I think that's the kind of key point, is that despite the fact that this pair have relinquished their royal titles in some way, they still use the Duchess and whatever kind of vocabulary, but they're not allowed to wear the medals, they're not allowed to have the privilege and all of that, but they do still have the privilege of deference. And not that I think it's, I'm not standing up for tabloids ripping women and being nasty about them, but you only have to pick up a copy of Closer or Heat magazine to see what they're saying about Katie Price. In the grand scheme of things, the way in which Meghan is treated tends to be in a very kind of, I would say, obsequious kind of way. And there's this individual who, aside from her acting career, really hasn't done very much for society, still enjoys the lionization of the royals. Still, the two of them they can do no wrong in many people's eyes, in a way which makes, anti-monarchists like us sick. But aside from that, the weaponization and commercialization of offence that these two are able to do is more sick-making. I mean, the fact we had Brexit, we also had Legxit. I mean, everyone's done they put zit on everything.
But
it's like, come on,
it's not reopen those
this
wounds.
Individual who we're meant to feel so sorry for being so put upon. In fact, I think it was in that interview with Wired, Harry came out and said, 70% of all of the hatred that my wife gets comes down to 50 accounts on Twitter. It was like, so what's the problem then? Just block them. I mean, doesn't every celebrity have a cohort of mad and unpleasant and bigoted and, sometimes dangerous followers who get obsessed with them? I mean, pretty much every public figure can list you at least 50 accounts of people who they would really rather would fall off the edge of the planet. But I mean, it's like they want celebrity. They want to sell the lattes and they want to do the Netflix deals and they want to do all of that, but they don't want the dirtiness that comes with it. And that's not to suggest that, it's not like, we'll just put up with it, society is bad and celebrity culture is bad and shut up. But I kind of am saying that, because you can't, unless you give anything to society, and I'm now sounding really moralistic, but I mean, screw it. Unless you do something, if your whole basis is being a royal, and not just that, but a royal who, not so long ago, spent most of his time being incredibly unwoke in different various uniforms and costumes, and I have very limited sympathy for you, and we shouldn't have to continuously capped off when they're not royals anymore.
Well, his most famous unwoke moment was obviously dressing up as a Nazi, which brings us beautifully into the next section, which is about the Cambridge Union has blacklisted the TV historian Andrew Graham Dixon because he essentially impersonated Hitler during a debate at the Union. Now, they've since rowed back a bit, and they've said they're not going to draw up a blacklist anymore of speakers. But I mean, it's quite a telling episode, isn't it, Tom? I mean,
no, it was. You wrote about this, so it was a debate about bad taste. Or
It was a debate about, is it possible to have good taste? And Graham Dixon was essentially arguing that the Nazis, because they were racist, that meant their bad morals gave them bad taste. Their vile racism led them to overlook great works of art. Basically the entire sort of modern art canon, they just dismissed as Jewish or,
degenerate or something,
pertaining to people of colour, that kind of thing, and so they could brush it aside. And obviously, most Nazi art being propaganda is just crap.
No, because I think that's what was really interesting about that was you just see the complete detachment of context from any of these discussions now whatsoever.
Yeah.
I mean, in some respects, you think it's probably a bit performative. They're trying to make a statement about themselves. I mean, did anyone genuinely complain? Was anyone genuinely upset? I mean, I haven't seen any, clear reporting to that effect, but it's just the trigger word or the trigger impersonation in this case, or whatever it is just enough. Even if you're making a kind of satirical anti-racist point by invoking the greatest villain of history, that counts for absolutely nothing. It's really, really interesting. It's just one of those things where you try and work out, again, is this a sort of genuine, sincere response? Or is this just because they see it as their kind of duty to do this and it's noble to do this and whatever? But it's interesting as well because it's the Cambridge Union as opposed to like the Students' Union or some sort of student group or whatever. And, they pride themselves historically on being this kind of home of free speech. Was it Cambridge who hosted Nick Griffin back in the day and got into a big controversy over that?
I know that Cambridge certainly hosted Marine Le Pen in the last
huge protests over that.
Yeah.
And so they would really kind of stick their necks out for free speech, and no doubt would welcome some of the controversy and the coverage as a result of that. But even in these institutions, it certainly is creeping in. I thought John Cleese's response was brilliant, to say that he was now calling off a future appearance at the Cambridge Union because, as someone who has impersonated Hitler on a number of occasions, he would kind of wants to cancel himself before anyone else gets there. So again, you're starting to see a bit of a kind of heartening pushback to this kind of behaviour. But it's offence culture detached from actually being offended.
Yeah,
what I mean? It's kind of preemptive, and that's the thing about it that I really don't get.
And it's so obvious that it's the ignorance of context, ignorance of intent. You can't be anti-racist unless you are anti-racist in the way that we say you should be. There's a kind of prescriptive nature of that. If you try and challenge someone, make them feel uncomfortable, even in the service of the good, that is forbidden.
Well, Graham Dixon's whole argument was that he was, and when you watch it, you think, would I have gone that far? Would I have said all those things? It's a bit like when someone wants to talk about the N-word and they repeatedly use the N-word as a means of showing what they're talking about context, and you think, all right, lay off.
It was a very long impression.
It was a very long impression. And you think, all right, you could have done it in a shorter time. But the whole point, maybe he was doing that to labour his point. And I think the really important fact is that, number one, the chair of the discussion, apparently was drunk, said he wasn't drunk. The whole thing about the Cambridge Union debate, I've done one of them, is it's this like incredibly posh, Larry kind of event, and people go too far. And that's kind of, it's like the Oxbridge scene. That's what they do. They all drink loads of like port and then go and have a debate. So in the context of that's important. But also more importantly, he came out afterwards and said sorry for causing offence, and he made it clear. He said, this is what I was trying to do and I'm sorry. And we talked about this before on the podcast. The whole thing about repentance is that if someone does offend, because obviously it's possible to offend and it happens all the time, and then they say, well, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean it to come across like that. In a civilized society, you're meant to be able to say, okay, if you're sincere, I believe you, and no hard feelings, shake your hands.
Yeah.
But the important thing is that there's been so much fuss about this Cambridge Union event, and this says something about the approach to anti-Semitism in society today, which is that if you have this sort of relatively manufactured fuss, as Tom says, how many people actually complain the stuff about anti-Semitism and a Hitler impression. At the same time, you have a play that gets put on in a London theatre about a fat cat, big capitalist, loads of money, terribly corrupt, blood money, all that kind of stuff. Guy called Herschel Fink, that goes on. And, several newspapers review it, including The Guardian, not picking up on the fact that it might be, somewhat anti-Semitic to use the most Jewish name anyone could think of to portray a, loads of money capitalist. No one cares about that. And so if as someone who's Jewish, or you don't even have to be Jewish, who's concerned about anti-Semitism, looking at the way in which you have these manufactured panics about offence in one way and then silence when it comes to real instances of anti-Semitism, or indeed what happened outside LSE recently, it makes you think, am I really supposed to care about this and not the other thing? It makes you question people's motives, I think.
It just makes it silly, doesn't it? Like you're saying, the thing that happened outside the LSE, which seems to happen outside of LSE, KCL, whenever anyone who has served or is serving in some sort of Israeli institution. It's happened to previous ambassadors. It's happened to people who just used to be in the army, given the fact there's national service over there. That includes a lot of people. Again, this kind of really vitriolic response. And that wasn't really covered outside. Certainly didn't make it onto the BBC News website or anything like that. So there's also a bit of a danger that you have these kind of safe, silly cases, which a few idiots get upset. And then we all get our rocks off for about 5 minutes, taking a piss out of them, which I'm not against. We've had a great 5 minutes here. But at the same time, these kind of more sinister things carry on. We all forget about that. We all forget about Kathleen Stock. All these things which are, again, feel much more serious, just aren't necessarily taken up. But again, I think it's in overreaching that they demonstrate the silliness of the ideology. So in that sense, the Cambridge Union have done us all a good service.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.